So the pilot program for assessing adverse childhood experiences. Madam Chairman, this was proposed by the Juvenile Court in Henrico County when we were looking at identifying a drug court that might be able to work at the juvenile level. We identified that there were very different variables in play that could motivate a child and a family to resolve that problem. And as the juvenile justices looked at it, they discerned that probably trauma was one of the most imperative issues in assessing those children, and that the court might need to adapt to that. And they believe that they should be doing trauma ACE assessments in the court to see if that could direct a better way to manage the children that were at risk. And most of these kids in juvenile court, let's be honest, have been traumatized, and maybe redirect a way to keep them from going to prison and find programs that actually worked. And they asked for a pilot program to be able to look at that. Of course, it would be considered throughout the state, but that is the first one, Madam Chairman. The second one is the Data Analytics Commission will hopefully be codified this year. Senator Barker is carrying that legislation, and they are always interested in looking at how solving problems for Virginia might cause cross-sections for different data trusts. And in this case, they would be looking at the ability, and this is something we've talked about before in this committee, of interconnecting education from pre-K all the way through to the workforce, and looking at aligning initiatives that children could use to figure out what they wanted to do, what jobs were available, how they got that education, and how they could pay for it. And the Data Commission was interested in looking at, there's no fiscal impact with this, it's language only, but looking at whether or not they could identify the data points they would need in a data trust to accomplish that. Let me see if this will just go forward for me. I apologize. The diagnostic assessment tool in 137-2S is a bill that just came out of committee that is looking at transitioning SOLs into 3 broken tests during the year. The first 2 would be diagnostic assessments to see where children were, so there was time to intervene before the assessment at the end of the year. That money may be available in the CARES Act for this year, but it would be needed going forward. 137-3 is another project for Data Commission to look at children with IEPs and how they're progressing, and looking at what data points we might need for that. 138-1S is a budget amendment that is from the JLOC report. There's several language-only budget amendments, Madam Chairman, that are from the JLOC report on special education, and they complement the bill that was the recommendations for them in code. That's the next budget amendment as well. In fact, all of these 138, I'm going to go through those. So that's all of the 138s. Virtual education, Madam Chairman, the state commissioner, I am losing the word, but Dr. Lane was very inventive this year in being able to look at the virtual education system that they had for a small number of children, 5,000, and when all of the school systems had to transition to virtual education, he was able to use CARES Act money for that platform to be able to support virtual education, and all 132 school divisions in Virginia are currently using that system in some way. And going forward, we're going to have virtual education that doesn't go away. And again, there's potentially CARES Act money for this year, but going forward, we will need to be making an investment in that platform so virtual education can continue in Virginia. I'm going to skip language only, Madam Chairman. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Thank you. Dual enrollment passport pilot grants. Madam Chairman, you remember the passport legislation that we passed that the community colleges and the 4 years work together to define the standard core curriculum of 30 credits that is universally recognized at all four-year institutions and at all community colleges so that children didn't have to duplicate those core curriculum credits. and pay for them a second time. And this pilot program would incentivize school divisions, especially those that have fewer assets and challenges, and the language in this bill directs that specifically in this budget amendment, but this would allow them for high schools to begin to drop that curriculum back into the dual enrollment so that we actually had guaranteed college credits that were completed in high school, and you didn't have to question whether or not your 4-year would accept that going forward. Vaccine administration workforce, Madam Chairman, this is for the vaccine bill we all signed on today. I did not know. Most of that is just permissive language, but I didn't know if VDE would need anything, so that was a placeholder just in case they did. The next two are bills that we looked at in special session and we liked but thought would be better for full session. School-based reimbursement services. This is a bill that will be coming up next year, and if you'll forgive me for a minute, to explain this, cost-based reimbursement is how we pay for school-based services. School-based services are, say, speech therapy or therapeutic day treatments that children get if they have an IEP in school and those needs are identified. Currently, those school-based services are paid for by the localities 100%. They then send a itemized report or cost-based reimbursement report to DMAS, and DMAS then submits that to the federal government, who pays the federal portion of those Medicaid-based services, and so the locality gets 50% back. There is a way to change the language in our state plan to allow those school divisions to bill not only for school-based services that are offered for IEPs, but for any child, which would give the schools more money to offset their local portion. Since we don't pay the state portion of those services, it would offset the expenses that they have, and they will be able to itemize in their list things like counseling and coordination for students, all Medicaid students, of course, but this is no cost to the state for all of those increased reimbursements. It's all non-general fund. The $500,000 placeholder in here is that in the process of doing that, because we do have reports that those services are not always accomplishing the outcomes we want for our children, DMAS would provide more oversight to ensure that the children are getting evidence-based programs that result in improved outcomes for them. And so I don't have a fiscal impact from DMAS on that yet, but that is what that holder is for. Permanent supportive housing, this is something we've talked about all the time. I had a specific request, especially with the addiction issues that we've had such a terrible spike with COVID, and so that is that. And auxiliary grants, Madam Chairman, is another problem that we've struggled with for so long. In particular, there are some ALFs or assisted living facilities in Virginia that have an extraordinarily high number of auxiliary grants as their residents, auxiliary grant recipients as their residents. And the auxiliary grants pay for less than half of the cost of those residents. And in COVID, these have been incredibly under incredible duress, especially when there has been decreased access to food banks and other resources they use to offset their costs. And so this was a way, knowing that the auxiliary grant budget amendment would be enormous in any way, to just target those charitable programs that are really providing care for our most at-need elderly in high volumes. Many of these assisted living facilities limit their auxiliary grant members to 2 to 3%, and some few out there are doing extraordinary work with 50% of their residents being there. So, Madam Chairman, that's all my budget amendments, and thank you for your patience.